Hi, I'm excited. The Endorphin's ground control sequencer. This is not new by any means, but they did just announce a version 3 firmware update for this. Shout out to the good people over at Endorphins for sending this over to me to play around with. So I want to spend a little time going over the new features of the firmware, kind of give you a little rundown of how this device works if you haven't used one of these before, and maybe along the way we'll manage to make a little bit of music in the process. So I don't want to waste any time. Let's get right to it. So with the version 3 firmware update, we now have random patterns like they've implemented on some of their other products recently. To access the random patterns, you hold the tempo button and press the 32nd division button for a Euclidean pattern, 16th button for a wide pattern, and 8th button for a narrow random pattern. Holding tempo and pressing the quarter note button will cause a variation to current random patterns in the ratchet, slides, and other settings while maintaining the melody's key. These work for both drum and melodic tracks. So let's hear some examples. You no longer need to remove the microSD from the module. Simply plug a USB A to B cable into your computer and the module, then hold the project button for about 5 seconds to enter USB mass storage. On the computer, you should see the microSD show up as a drive that you can access to add firmware files going forward. To exit mass storage mode, hold the project button again for roughly 5 seconds and it will animate back to your normal sequencer. Speaking of, let's take a quick look at the firmware update process since I had to do this with this version Endorphin sent me. Because it's in this spiffy little case, I first had to remove the sequencer to get access to the microSD card on the back of the module. It's easy enough to remove the microSD, but I will say getting it back in place without the help of some tweezers requires another level of focus, so I'm grateful we won't have to do this going forward. After inserting the microSD into my computer, I can simply drag the new firmware file into the drive and safely eject it from my Mac. Trust me, I trimmed this part of the video. It took me a few minutes to get the microSD back inserted on top of this board. As soon as you power up the module, it should show the word burn on the display indicating it's erased and installed the new firmware with this nifty little powering up animation sequence. And just like that, we're up and running the version 3 firmware. We now have access to 128 steps per pattern for all 4 tracks as shown here. In the instance, you want to clear all of the data in terms of saved patterns and projects in the sequencer and start with a clean micro SD card. They've added a quick formatting method. Again, with the USB cable plugged into the computer, we can hold the project button for 5 seconds to enter mass USB storage mode. To format the micro SD, you hold the tempo button briefly until the display says format. You then have to confirm the formatting with play or cancel with stop. Now when you exit USB mass storage mode, the sequencer will be completely wiped empty without having to manually do so or remove the card from the module.
They've also added a quick way to delete projects. If you have saved projects you want to delete, it's important you don't have the sequencer in playback. It should be stopped, otherwise it will just load the selected project. Press the project and last step buttons together. Now holding tempo when selecting any of the saved projects via the keyboard will ask if you want to delete on the display. Again, confirm with play or cancel with stop. Okay, a couple other things that are worth mentioning about the firmware update. They improved a bug where when the sequencer was running under an external MIDI clock, the notes played by the sequencer remain on the MIDI clock's grid. I guess they also improved the time quantizer for live arpeggiated notes, so those are tighter to the track's grid as well. Now when you're loading a new project, it will stay in live mode, so there's less key presses. Let's say if you're doing a live performance across multiple projects. It sounds like they fixed an issue with the all drums mute button as well as some startup animations. And then lastly, they reworked the external clock input under a 1 pulse per step condition. That way, if you have a external clock that's kind of variable speed, it will still cause these preset input divisions. Okay, I think that covers everything for the version 3 firmware update for this. You guys know I'm typically not much for tutorials on this channel, but when we're talking about something like a sequencer that just has so much functionality, I think it would be amiss to not kind of go over the basic controls, how to get up and running with one of these things, especially if you haven't used ground control before. So I'm gonna try not to take up too much of the video on this portion. Why don't we we'll set a timer, 3 minutes. Give me 3 minutes and I'll kind of give you the rundown of how to get up and running with this. Okay, that's probably a little bit of a lofty goal, but we'll give it a shot. Here we go.
This is a 42 HP with Eurorack sequencer with a 2-octave keyboard. Basic transport buttons of play and stop to begin and end sequence playback, and they function as yes and no. There are designated channel buttons for the 4 tracks under the display to designate parameters. You have mute buttons for each of the individual tracks, as well as a global mute for the drums. These default to be unquantized, but holding one of the buttons for 1 second changes their default to be quantized mutes. You can also press tempo plus mute to solo a track. The top keys designated 1 through 8 correspond to the 8 individual drum tracks for selection and playback. You have a host USB jack to power another device like an external keyboard, 4 external CV inputs that are assignable in the menu, track resets, and clock in and out. Holding the 2 page buttons briefly will allow you to change through all 4 patterns simultaneously, which is useful for live performance. Holding the last step button shows the pattern length for each track. You can adjust by intervals of 16 with the pattern buttons and individually with the transpose buttons for each of the 4 tracks. There are designated menus for each of the parameters written below the bottom keys, or A through N, that are accessible by holding the tempo button and pressing the desired option or key. Things like polyrhythms listed as arpeggio on the first key, pattern shift, metronome, sequence direction, external CV assignment through the menu, ratchets, lots of control and flexibility here. Holding the project button and pressing a track's mute button will quickly clear patterns. Holding project and pressing the track's mute button twice will clear patterns and assign a default pattern length of 16 steps. Okay, to live record drums, you select whichever drum sample you want to record via the keyboard labeled 1 through 8, and with the sequencer playing, short press record. You can then press the keys at your desired timings and the inputted notes will be quantized to the grid. To enter the Zoc-style drum sequencing, you hold the record button with track D selected. While the sequence plays, you can see it move through the pattern. The current panel has helpful black outlines for the 4/4 beats of the 16 steps in this mode. Enter the sequence in the available 16 keys with the desired drum voice selected. To live record melodic tracks, short press the record button with the sequence running and the desired track selected, and any keys you press through the running pattern will be quantized to the grid. To step record, press the record button with the sequence stopped. You can individually enter notes on the keyboard as well as any desired rests in between notes with the tempo button. If you need to edit a sequence, you can long press the record button until it shows edit on the display, and you can step through the sequence with the pattern left and right buttons and change notes by pressing different keys. The arpeggiator on the melodic tracks is accessed with the sequence running and by selecting up, down, random, or order designated in small text with the speed division button so the button blinks. You can then play notes on the keyboard or select the last step button to latch the inputted keys. To adjust the arpeggiator speed, you hold the current track button and select quarter, 8, 16th, or 32nd note buttons. You can also adjust the octave range by holding the division button and using the octave minus and plus buttons to adjust 1 or 2 octaves up or down. Then the arpeggiator feature for the drum track functions as a roller or repeater. Activating the arpeggiator in similar fashion with the sequencer playing and then pressing the desired tempo division button so it's blinking will cause the drum voice pressed on the key bed to roll or repeat at that speed division. To transpose a recorded sequence's pitch higher or lower across the scale, you hold the octave minus and plus buttons together until the display shows semi for semitones. Now pressing a different key will move the sequence to a different pitch up and down the keyboard range. If you have multiple patterns programmed and you want to chain them together so they play in a specific order, especially for live performance, you hold the desired track button and select the pattern's letter on the keyboard the amount of times you want each to play. As demonstrated here, it will now play sequence A twice, B once, C once, and D 3 times in order automatically. A period behind a pattern specifies a change in the sequence since the last time it was saved. To save all your patterns in one of the available 24 projects, press the project button followed by record, then another press of the record button saves all patterns in the current project. And then lastly, to access all the projects, you press the project button followed by the last step button. Now, using any of the 24 keys, you can select a different project.
All right, if we're gonna make music with this thing, we gotta get it racked. You guys know I don't like to waste any time. All right, to throw a little start to a song together, we'll go with 132 beats per minute, and we'll make a layered kick with the Bassimilus module and a sample that sounds like this together. We'll make a snare drum with the Manus oscillator and a layered sample. We'll get an arpeggiated pad recorded. Now I want to generate some washed out distortions with the Piston Honda. Lastly, I gotta implement the random sequences into this for sure. And adding some other textures in similar fashion, here's what we got. So I hope you enjoyed some of the ambient stuff I was putting together there. I can honestly say it's been a little bit now since I've really been inspired to work in modular land now for a little bit. I think having a sequencer like this that has a very familiar 2-octave keyboard, the ability to write with a little bit more intention with a controller like this just is really exciting to me. But then not to mention like the random feature that they've added to this to generate either drum rhythms or melodies kind of really quick. And even if they're not perfect, you can go in and just edit those sequences that are kind of formulated real quick after cycling through some of them. Super powerful in my opinion for music creation. So I can honestly say I'm stoked to add this into the arsenal, the tools for production going forward here. And that's pretty much all I got for you. So if you guys have any questions about the new firmware update or functionality of this device in general, feel free to drop a comment and go make some music now. I'll see you guys when I see you.